differences. The thing that makes a Mormon unique is the body of knowledge that departs from the Orthodox Christian doctrine that you can pretty well, it's not totally definite, but the doctrine of the Christian doctrine has some definite basic things that the Mormon theology departs from. There's got quite a list of them. For example, they believe in God has a body, and they believe in three separate distinct personalities involving God, and that separates them from the Trinity believers.
You know that a recent article in the Harvard Theological Review argued, I think quite persuasively, that for the first several centuries of Christianity, probably the majority of Christians believed that God had a body. So, by your definition, if you're saying that disqualifies someone from being a Christian,
Phil, let him finish his statement here before you jump in. Go ahead.
If you're saying that believing that God has a body disqualifies someone from being a Christian, then it's arguable that for the first 3 or so centuries of Christianity, the majority of Christians were not Christian, which seems to me a very, very strange point of view.
But there was one subject I want to talk to you talk about a little bit, and Mormons keep saying that the early Christians taught our version of eternal progression, and I would agree that they taught, some sort of it's called deification, becoming like Christ and all. But it seems that throughout, when these fellows taught this doctrine and used, the phrases of, man can become gods and free to become gods and things like that, but they still maintained this difference, this fundamental difference between God the Father and human beings, even when they're deified.
I think that may be true. I would say that most of the evidence we have for the doctrine of deification comes from a relatively late period. So I would expect, since by then the view of the nature of God was so very different from what I think it was in earliest Christianity, that you would have also a difference in the doctrine of deification. What I think that doctrine points to, though, is a doctrine that goes back to an earlier time. You have a formula that's very, very common, even in subsequent centuries of the Church, in contexts that I think are really surprising, with St. Athanasius, for example, as late as a French Christmas carol that I'm aware of, where the statement is made that God became man so that man could become God. And it's a statement, no one really knows where it originated. It seems to go back and back and back. It has a trajectory that if you can follow it, seems to go back to the very earliest days of Christianity. I would argue, since I contend that the earliest view of God in Christianity was probably anthropomorphic and relatively like that held by the Latter-day Saints today, but the meaning of that statement would also have changed correspondingly. So that when I see it showing up in later times, I think it's true. There are some distinctions to be made between the Latter-day Saint view of deification and the view that you'll find in the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, or in 13th century Eastern Orthodoxy. But those don't surprise me. I would expect that, given our doctrine of the apostasy.
I'd like to note a comment that was made by a very distinguished German Protestant church historian by the name of Ernst Benz, talking about the Mormon doctrine of deification. He says this: one can think what one wants of this doctrine of progressive deification to the Latter-day Saints, but one thing is certain. With this anthropology, Joseph Smith is closer to the view of man held by the ancient church than the precursors of the Augustinian doctrine of original sin were, who considered the thought of such a substantial connection between God and man as the heresy par excellence. Just to say then, there may be differences. We're certainly not going to suggest there aren't. In fact, given our belief in progressive continuous revelation, we wouldn't necessarily expect that in each dispensation the same amount of light and knowledge had been given on all subjects. And so if there are differences, we're not bothered by it, but we do see something, and it's something that not merely we see, but people who stand outside of the Latter-day Saint tradition also note.
Well, I don't have a real problem with the Mormon version of the afterlife, where families are are united and the family unit is continued. I mean, we can go back to the Garden of Eden and God's intention there to establish that. But to say that because humans are now have stewardship and dominion over the entire universe and can organize matter and organize planets and things like that does not make humanity gods per se. And in fact, I would say that the scriptures point to a fundamental, not a really important difference, but a fundamental difference between God and man. You know, it's a difference that's going to be narrowed a bit.
Well, I think that there obviously is a difference now, and
well, I think there always will be.
I agree with that too. That there will always be this difference, that the Father will everlastingly be above us.
But you got somebody being above him, and I don't.
Well, we know very, very little about that. That's largely speculation, though I presume that's true.
Well, Mormons love speculation.
Yes, well, it's
as do all members of religion to a certain extent.
But you do have passages in the Bible that suggest a kind of kinship between man and God. For example, you have Paul in Acts 17, I believe, addressing the people on Mars Hill, the Areopagus in Athens, and quoting a passage where it says that men are the offspring of God, and the word used there is genos, which means family, or it's related to our word kin. So the Latter-day Saint view on this issue, it seems to me, is quite clearly has biblical precedent. That there is a relationship between us, that we are akin, that we're of the same genus.
Sure. Thank you. We need to move along now. Some great comments. Another thing that might be mentioned on that same topic is the comment of Christ that he has done nothing save that which he's seen his Father do. Paraphrase there a bit. But the point would be that this is some kind of an ongoing progressive thing. Hi, caller, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Your first name, please.
Anna?
Anna, thanks for joining us tonight.
Listen, isn't it true, you've been talking a little bit about it, but that you believe, the Mormon people believe in that there are many, many gods, and like the pagans believe, and I think that is a pagan belief, and that bothers me. That, you believe that there's God's many and Lord's many and such things as that.
That's a great quote out of the New Testament you just made. Okay. God's many and Lord's many. That's Paul. That's from the Apostle Paul.
Well, and I believe that we're supposed to just have one God, no other gods before us. And how can you have all these gods if you're only supposed to have only one God before you?
Well, first of all, I think it needs to be said that whatever the merits of the argument on this thing, it still doesn't affect the question of whether Latter-day Saints are Christians. We have to keep repeating that because people get lost in
Well, excuse me, but if you're pagans, you're not Christians.
Oh, that's right, we're not pagans.
Okay.
First of all, you have to understand, I have never met a Mormon who worships thousands of gods.
Mm-hmm.
I have never met one. I've never heard of one. I've been all over the place. I haven't seen any of them. In fact, Latter-day Saints were instructed some years ago by Elder McConkie of the Quorum of 12 that we worship, strictly speaking, he said we worship only the Father, not even the Son. We worship the Father through the Son, or in the name of the Son. That's a very, very monotheistic teaching. This idea that there's some sort of Mormon pantheon of deities is simply not true. The thing about paganism, what made pagan polytheism so irritating to early Christians and others, and to Jews, was that you had these endlessly squabbling gods who weren't very moral. They're constantly trying to do one another in and stab one another in the back and cheat on one another.
Well, they were good gods too. They weren't all bad.
There were not very many who were really very good. And that picture, of course, is something the Latter-day Saints utterly and absolutely reject. We don't believe in any such thing. So, in that sense, I find the description of Mormons as pagans extremely objectionable and misleading.
Another point that ought to be made here is that many people who were early Christians had the concept that there was more than one God. They didn't worship them. They didn't believe they were somehow conflicting or contradictory with the Christian faith as a whole. You find such notables as Origen, Clement of Alexandria. Well, I mean, the list could go on and on. But the point is that this is a concept that many early Christians believed that people could become very much like God, and they used the phrase God to describe these people after they had obtained salvation.